The act of moving onward means we pass these signposts. One of them was first leaving Earth. The next one is hanging out on the moon. What's next? The planets. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together. This fragile little world. This fragile little world. Onward to the edge. We're moving onward to the edge. Here we are together.
Hello and welcome to Voices from L5. I'm your host Liam Ginty, and today with me I have Dr. Christopher Newman, a reader in law at Sunderland, who has some interesting ideas about sustainability and the moral justification for space exploitation. Hey Christopher, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks, Liam. Very glad to be here. Very pleased that you asked me to come on. It's some fascinating work you've been doing on the podcast, and I'm really pleased to be a part of it.
Well, thank you very much. It's always nice to hear that. I mean, your work really touches upon a lot of the stuff that we like to cover on this podcast, and you're also doing some great stuff. But while we're patting ourselves on the back a little bit, why don't we roll back and hear a little bit about you and what your work is exactly, and how were you interested in space? Okay.
Well, funny enough, I started working in areas of counter-proliferation in a previous life, looking at, transfer of missile technology and things like that. And I first where I first came upon this notion of space law and outer space law. And then I moved to be a practitioner. I was a practicing solicitor and kind of lost touch with it. And it was always something that I really wanted to go back to. So when I became an academic, it was great opportunity to sort of rekindle my interest in the area of regulation of space activity. I sort of, I identify myself as a space lawyer, but I think really, truly, it's more, I'm interested in the notion of space governance, because I think law implies a very specific set of rules and codified way of working. And actually, I think, space doesn't work like that. It can't work like that. So what instead when I'm addressing my students, when I'm addressing, people such as yourself or at conferences, I always try and make the point, fairly early on, that actually I'm more than a space lawyer. It's space policy, it's space ethics, it's space governance, it's all of that package. And then, sort of my work has then gone on to examine this notion of sustainability, because for a piece I was writing, I discovered that in certain respects, in certain areas, there wasn't really any notion of what sustainability meant in space activity. I think we're at a stage now where, we've got a commercial imperative where we previously had a political imperative, to explore space. Well, now we've got a commercial imperative, and that's driving things along fairly nicely. But companies are companies. Their job is to make money. That's their primary focus, and the ones that succeed are the ones that do it well, because they've got that focus. Now, what I'm trying to do is say, well, yes, I appreciate that companies and commerce is a really important and really significant part of the space, environment. But we need to just bear in mind that we're going into pristine environments, and these pristine environments, once you've defiled them, there's no going back. It's a fairly permanent major step. I mean, you look at the moon, for example. The moon is an area of particular interest for me, because it's such a fragile environment. It can't repair itself in the way that the planet Earth can repair itself, and yet it's our celestial sibling. It's up there, we see it. People fall in love under the light of a silvery moon, and people worship it as gods. It has all sorts of cultural and physical links to our planet. And so I think we need to just be mindful when we're doing this activity that we've got a chance now, almost of a clean slate. In the Cold War, where the architecture of modern space governance was forged, we had a situation where just getting there was tough enough. Just actually getting to the moon was really tough. So we couldn't think about, and by we I'm talking in sort of humans. As humans, couldn't think of the environmental issues, because, to be frank, we didn't have the luxury of the technology to allow us to do that. And I think as well, the environmental movement hadn't really taken hold in the mainstream in the way that it has now. So you had a situation where space exploration developed along certain lines, and those lines were geopolitical. Now it seems to be that it's developing very much amongst commerce and commercial lines. So what I'm trying to do is not provide any answers, but at least start a conversation about what the underpinning ethical drive, what the underpinning values behind our space exploration should be. If it's going to be just money, that's a decision that we can make. But I think we need to be aware of the ramifications of that decision.
Right. The conversation needs to happen regardless of what the inevitable answer ends up being.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Chris. I mean, it sounds like a lot of stuff that we've touched upon a little bit in the show before. The Adam Manning show and the Tony Manning episodes in particular covered a little bit of the ethical and moral ramifications that we face when we're exploiting space. And I mean, this all sort of comes down to one of the titles of your papers, one of the ones I found from you about sustainability. Sustainably exploring and developing space. In that paper, which I can link in this episode, you mentioned the belief that the moon isn't. We can focus on the moon, but I think this is something that can apply to a great deal of space, at least generally. You mentioned that you don't feel like the moon is an economically viable place to mine.
Yeah. I should heavily caveat that, that I base that on the findings of Ian Crawford, who is a scientist, in London. And he has conducted quite an in-depth study of all of the previous lunar surveys. And he's sort of pulled it all together. And he's produced a paper. It's a really good paper on the actual, what is on the moon? What are we going to find if we do start digging up? Mm-hmm. And so it's based largely around that discussion and, a little bit around other papers that I've found that are advocating, mining rights for helium-3. Well, I always think the discussion about helium-3 is kind of like ham and eggs. If we had ham, we could have ham and eggs for breakfast. We can't do it yet. The technology's just not there. So we can have mining rights, and that's absolutely dandy. But it's not going to actually address, it's going to be so far in the future, in real terms, that it's going to be a redundant regime because it's not going to be able to be tested, and what works for helium-3 may not work for anything else. So,
right.
Like I say, my papers, it's based on Crawford's survey, which is based on a number of different surveys. So that sort of probably helps give a bit of context to it.
Mm-hmm. It's somewhat, the thing you just said there where it's so far in the future somewhat makes me think of the various moon treaties of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, which try to go into protection of the moon and protection of the various celestial bodies for, human heritage reasons, and how, the ability for us to actually exploit those bodies is fairly far off, or if not fairly far off, was far off at the time. That means those treaties may be slightly, if I remember, in our Tony Milligan episode that I'm not allowed to call them toothless, but maybe a little bit redundant at this point, where the technology is advanced to a point where the language in those laws may not necessarily apply so much anymore.
Yeah, it's an interesting one about the various treaties, because you've got the Outer Space Treaty. It's sometimes referred to as the Magna Carta of space law, but I don't actually think that's true. Because I think it's much more active than Magna Carta is. You can't rely on Magna Carta in an English court, for example. Mm-hmm. You can't rely on the moon, on the Outer Space Treaty either. But when normative practice is emerging, generally, the Outer Space Treaty is the first port of call. When I'm teaching my students, for example, the first question I teach them about space law is, what does the Outer Space Treaty say about it? Now, that'll have either one of three answers. It'll either be, it explicitly deals with it. So nuclear weapons, for example, explicitly prohibits it. It may be that it doesn't say anything at all. So, commercial space, it doesn't really say anything about that. Or it may be that it implies. So, there is a little bit of environmental protection in there, only slight and not really effective, but it is in there. It is Article 9 of the treaty. Does have a little bit of environmental protection in there. And then it had its progenitor treaties. So you had the rescue agreement, the registration convention, you had the liability convention, and then you have the moon treaty as well. Now, the others had quite broad acceptance. The Moon Treaty didn't. Now, the Moon Treaty was the last of the big international space law treaties, and that was signed in that was open for signature in 1979. I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but I'm going to say to you, only a handful of nations have signed it.
Mm-hmm. Many of which have no space
Many of which have no space capacity at all, or are very limited. Now, there is India getting involved with it, I think. And France, I believe, again, I'd have to check that out. But even so, the big space players, the United States, Russia, China, they haven't got involved with it. And, and in fact, they're actually steering clear of it because of a mechanism I'll talk about a bit later on about customary international law and how that sort of sits at the background and they don't want to be seen to be complying with it in case they're seen to be, corresponding to normative values, which sort of pushes it into the realms of customary international law. So what we've got is a situation where actually the Outer Space Treaty, I wouldn't say it was toothless, because what I think it does do, in terms of a law, it doesn't really do it, because yes, it prohibits nuclear weapons, but it doesn't tell you what happens if you put nuclear weapons up there.
Right.
It doesn't, so there's no sort of, there's no sanctions mentioned in the Outer Space Treaty. It's all aspirate. We're going to say we're not going to do this. If you do it, well, you've broken the treaty. But there's no explicit sanctions to what happens if that's the case. So it's not so much a law as we would recognise it. There's not going to be an international space police force that are going to enforce it. It's not like that. It's more of a treaty document whereby shared values are communicated, and there are certain things that I think have seeped into to space exploration. And I think one of those things is this desire not to have nuclear weapons and not to have weapons of mass destruction. Although, whilst we understand what we mean by nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction is a slightly more ambiguous term that covers a multitude of sins and perhaps leaves out some things that you would consider to be quite destructive. But but there is a consensus around that. There seems to be a consensus against the appropriation by a state of a part of, a celestial body, and specifically the moon. Mm-hmm. So there's a consensus around that as well. I think there's a consensus around the state liability regime that gives it sort of a parity with maritime law and the flags of registration and that type of thing. So there's certain values in the Outer Space Treaty that make it a useful peg. And so I think in that respect, it's worked a treat. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of the Moon Treaty is just dropped in from the Outer Space Treaty. A lot of it's restating it. But there's two critical points that I think that I think the Moon Treaty does particularly badly, and that means that it's inevitably going to fail. The first thing it does is it introduces this common heritage of mankind principle. Okay. It introduces this principle that effectively says, we're going to try and set up an international body. We're going to try and distribute the resources. And it makes a really quite a sweeping statement as to how it's going to manage the lunar resources. Mm-hmm. And I think the big problem that you have with it is that there's no real understanding as to what this common heritage principle is. It's to be found in Article 11.1, and it says basically the moon and its natural resources are the common heritage of mankind. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? Well, what it means is state parties to the agreement, we're now going to Article 11.5, state parties to the agreement undertake to establish an international regime, including appropriate procedures to govern the exploitations of the natural resources of the moon, as such exploitation is about to become feasible. So, what they're saying here is, okay, it's a common heritage of mankind. Well, that has been, what that means has been debated in international law quite significantly, actually. And I touch on this in my paper when I talk about some of the problems that the lunar regulation faces. I take you to section 4 of it where I talk about the political dimension to lunar sustainability. So you've got this concept of common heritage of mankind principle that there's no real agreement with. Well, if you're a state, you're not going to sign up to an international treaty where one of the fundamental principles is obscure. You know, so Article 11 effectively torpedoes the chances of the Moon Treaty ever getting sort of recognition in the form that it is in now. Okay. When it talks, I think another thing that's often overlooked about the Moon Treaty is Article 1, Article 1.1. The provisions of this agreement relating to the Moon shall also apply to other celestial bodies within the solar system other than the Earth, except insofar as a specific legal norms enter into force with respect to any of these celestial bodies. What that's doing there is it's conflating the Moon with other celestial bodies.
Ah, right. So in effect, the Moon Treaty covers every planet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not just planet, actually. Everything in space.
Everything. And that's the problem. Because what that means is you're talking comets, you're talking asteroids, you're talking Mars, you're talking the moons of Mars, you're talking everything. You're talking a lot of things are coming within that. Now, I firmly believe that when you're dealing with as diverse and dynamic an environment as space, one size can't fit all. You know, I think you've got to look at the body that you're dealing with of itself. Make it a question of fact rather than a question of law. So have it as, trying to say we're going to treat the Moon and we're going to treat everything else as we would treat the Moon, I think, it's trying a one size fits all approach. Now, I think the problem with that is, and the problem you get with that is, as I've said before, the Moon has a cultural significance that other celestial bodies don't have. I'm not sure any of us are going to be particularly exercised about a company deciding to strip mine a near-Earth asteroid, for example,
right,
and get as much valuable stuff as we can out of it. But I do think people will get upset if they look up to, if star-crossed lovers looking up to the light of the silvery moon and they can see a big strip mine right down the middle of it. So I don't see how you can treat the two as the same, and I think that's one of the things that the Moon Treaty does badly. I think it isn't the Moon Treaty, it's the Moon and other celestial bodies, and I think that's part of the problem with it. Right.
And it's certainly a far, just from hearing that, it's just so far reaching that really it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense when, like you said, the cultural heritage tied with the Moon and the way how we look at the Moon is certainly a lot different than the way that we look at, as you said, an asteroid, for example. And trying to conflate the two is just sort of preposterous. I can see why the Moon Treaty maybe didn't get the sort of following that was hoped to at that point.
And it's a shame because actually a lot of it is sound common sense, because we've got Article 2, which, pulls international law to governing the Moon. You've got Article 3, which is, the Moon shall be used for exclusively peaceful purposes. Well, I think we can all get behind that.
Yeah, it's just a nice idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Freedom of scientific investigations under Article 6. There's some environmental issues there as well. I mean, they don't, the environmental protection of the Moon in the Moon Treaty is still pretty feeble. And Lotte Vicari in her book, talking about the environmental element of space law, she makes the point that actually there's a few terms in here when they're talking about harmful contamination, and they actually think, well, harmful to whom? Are we talking harmful to humans? Are we talking harmful to the Moon? Because the two could be very different.
Right.
So there is some embryonic protection of the environment in the Moon Treaty, but nowhere near as you would expect or hope. Certainly nowhere near as you would see should the treaty be drafted now. But I think that's crucial. That's sort of my first crucial point. That actually, you look at the year of it, it's 1979, the last overarching space law treaty. 1979. They've kind of fallen out of favour of big binding treaties. You only have to look at the difficulties with the Kyoto Agreement and the Lima Agreement in regards of environmental issues and, global warming. It's really tough to get, big international agreements because there's so many different state interests at play here. So you've got a situation where actually what you're seeing now is small, more agile, more bespoke, and more, short-lasting agreements that are popping up. So some by treaties between states, some bilateral, some multilateral treaties. You've got the European Space Agency, which is effectively a treaty organization. You've got cooperation between the United States and India on a certain level. So you have got a legal framework now, but it's very different in style and to what it used to be like. And you've now got, like I say, these smaller, agiler, bespoke treaties dealing with specific issues and specific agreements. The UN still does some great stuff through COPUOS, and it's still, I think the UN's had a bit of an image problem over the last few years, and I think, it's not the most loved of institutions, but actually in terms of what it does through COPUOS, which is the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, it does try to, have technology sharing. It's got a long-term sustainability working group, so it does try and ensure the, safe and sustainable use of outer space. So, I don't want to beat up on the UN, because I think it's getting beat up enough, to be frank. But, it's not the primary tool of international law anymore, I would suggest. I think, heads of government have been overheard to say that actually the G20 and the G8 are probably more significant than the UN General Assembly, and I think that's possibly a truism. But the UN does still do some relevant work in space governance, and it's still a really useful forum for technology sharing and for discussing legal issues and for trying to hammer out normative behaviour. So, I think the architecture of the world has changed. The global geopolitical architecture has changed. We've gone from a binary system where Russia and America were at each other's throats, and we've now got a very multi-sectored space world. Mm-hmm. So, the geopolitics has moved on, and I suppose astropolitics has moved on as well.
And do you think that maybe that opens up with the answer to some of the issues that you're raising in your paper and your work, which is the difficulty of attaining an international consensus on what you're referring to as normative behavior, on space sustainability and such? Do you think the answer there lies in smaller, more agile, treaties and agreements between nations and larger multinational corporations now?
Well, I think Liam, you're spot on. You're spot on there, because I think there needs to be a multi-sectored agreement. There can't just be a state-by-state agreement, which maybe means that treaty isn't the appropriate way to go forward, because, of course, big companies can't sign treaties, in the way that states can. It's a slightly different, it's a slightly different regime, but, in the sense of establishing normative behavior, we need to get the people and the groups and the companies who are the leading players in the game. We need to bring them on board and decide, look, this is normative. Mm-hmm. And I will say that it's not, I hope I haven't painted too bleak a picture in my work, because actually there is some recognition. You've got Robert Bigelow, and I give you the quote from Robert Bigelow in my work, and he said, we better start to change our behaviour, and we cannot export off Earth the same irresponsible behaviour that we're conducting today on this planet, but have conducted for millennia. As human beings, our record is absolutely terrible, and I think we owe responsibility to space exploration, space existence of an entirely different level of attitude and respect. So that's coming from one of the entrepreneurs looking to make money from space. So it's not a hopeless situation. I think there is a recognition there that sustainability can occur, but it needs to tie in with the self-interest of the states, and it needs to tie in with the commercial imperative. And this is why I'm actually arguing that, why not revivify and re-examine the moon in light of the findings that there might not be that much there to make it economically viable to mine. Sure, use it as a transport hub. Absolutely. Use it as a base for scientific research. That, I think that's great. That's exactly what we should be doing. But I think the speculative commercial mining, which you sometimes hear about, I don't think does either, the environment or the companies any favours, because, the regulation should steer the companies towards things that are going to actually make them money. Mm-hmm.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned Bigelow, but I actually think a great deal of the major companies the major space players anyway, are headed by folks who have a good mind for sustainability. I feel like anyone listening at home can take a drink now because we're about to mention him, but Elon Musk, is, pretty famously, a proponent of the electric car and solar power and that sort of thing. And as far as I may be skeptical of his other business endeavors, that sort of makes me feel like Elon probably has an eye for the sustainable. And, with him, Bigelow, And with the way how the current geopolitical landscape looks toward a slightly more green, they like to keep using, future, I can sort of see us approaching space with a sustainable mindset in the future.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think so slowly but surely we're turning, the conversation is turning to an ecological ethic, if you like. And that sort of feeds into where I think we should be going and asking, okay, we've done the tough bit now. We've got there. Getting to space is still difficult, but it's nowhere near as difficult as it was, 50, 40 years ago. So why don't we now pause and think, well, why are we going? Why are we going up there? Is it just to make money? Is it just to act as just to, take mercantile, sort of ethos into the stars, or bring it back to Earth? And I do think there's a question there of, mining asteroids. The Earth at the minute is a fairly closed ecosystem. Yeah, we do have the occasional object coming from space that makes it through the atmosphere. But generally we're a fairly closed ecosystem. If we start importing elements from outside that closed ecosystem, we're changing the balance. We're changing the balance of the Earth. And, I think that's something we might want to think about.
We're bringing it over to the moral justification aspect of some of your work now, I think.
Sure, yeah.
Which is definitely some of the more interesting parts of this whole conversation. I think the economical and the sustainable element does get touched upon a lot. And I mean, even in the public mindset, you've got things like the Kepler syndrome that people like to talk about, which is, space sustainability on a massive scale. It's the equivalent of space as global warming. But the moral justification doesn't often get touched upon, I don't think.
I agree, and I think that's something, because anything that's, I'm as passionate a space advocate as you will find. I think space exploration it's fundamental to what we do as a species, and I think we're taking our first small steps now, and I think it's fabulous. But I don't think that enthusiasm should be unfettered. I don't think we should just say, right, we're going to go out and we're going to do what we. I think there needs to be a question of, okay, well, why are we doing this? Because it's the classic question that we get countered back, isn't it? When we've got all these problems here on Earth, why are we wasting money trying to go and speak to Martians? Mm-hmm. And it's the first question any space advocate gets asked, and the reply will tend to vary around, exploration and something implicit in humanity, and then it'll drift onto minerals and the possibilities, and then it'll probably even go to the Apollo program and look at all the offshoot technology that we've got. So that's generally the trajectory of a discussion like that. Mm-hmm. Too often in the space advocacy community, though, we don't go, well, that's a fair point. That's a fair point. Why are we doing this? What is the reason behind this? Why are we choosing to prioritize this as opposed to others? And I think that's the question. If we're going up there just to make money, great. That's okay. But we need to understand the limitations of that. Mm-hmm. We need to understand the limitations of that, and that it's going to have a price, and that the price is going to be, pivoting back to sustainability, it's going to be that, because companies care about making money. That's what they do. That's what they want to do. And they're going to make money any way they can until they're told not to, And so that's where the need for a sustainability agenda comes in. So we can actually shape the regulation of the new space age and say, okay, you can't be unfettered in your money making. You have to pay attention to the environment you're in. And so almost the ethical underpinnings. I mean, I should say, and I stress this, I'm not an ethicist. I'm not a trained ethicist. I am a regulator and a lawyer, and that's where I come from. So my thoughts are that, one of the first questions when you're pulling together legal regulation or a regulatory framework is what's the ethos of the place that you're trying to regulate? And I'm trying to find that out. Mm-hmm. What is the ethos of space exploration? Why are we doing it? Are we just doing it because it's, because we like space? Or are we doing it for a different reason? Are we doing it for an exploratory reason? Are we doing it to safeguard the species? Are we doing it to make money? Is it a mixture of all of these? It doesn't have to be a single unifying aim. Mm-hmm. But I do think we need to think what's the mission statement, if you like.
Right. It's strange how it's just never put into a question. It's often just stated by whoever is currently speaking on the topic, and the assumption is just that is what we're all aiming for. I mean, bringing him back, Elon Musk says that we should explore space to make sure that the species doesn't go extinct. And I think, I'm not sure what Bigelow is saying for it, but I imagine it comes down to some economic or exploratory reason. NASA famously is all about discovering new life now. And these wide ethoses, is that a word?
Yeah, it is now.
Ethoses. Those wide-ranging philosophies towards space exploration are all well and good, but it would be, I think, a very important thing to just lay the question flat on the table and ask ultimately, what are we as a species doing? Or why are we as a species doing this? I agree with you. Some of you at home may know, but I do, in fact, like going into space a lot. And I am a proponent of the space advocacy movement, but I also find myself asking these questions a lot. Why do we do these things, and why do we explore it? And I think in a lot of ways, space has this idea of being a wild west around it still, where we're still finding our footing and still discovering why and where and how we're going to be doing these things. But really, I think it's time for us to move away from that level of thinking. Space doesn't have to continue being a Wild West forever. We only need to start asking these questions and that in and of itself will start to help guide us toward a more sustained model of why we're doing these things, and a more sustained ethos, as you put it, of the human mission statement for space exploration.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you've hit upon a really interesting sort of conundrum here, because you either get this sort of implicit understanding that, of course, we're exploring space, and then you get mention of a duty. Now, I talk about that in my article, establishing an ecological ethical paradigm for space activity, because this notion of duty can sort of conflate two different moralities and moral paradigms, if you like.
Ah, yes, yeah. I found this part very, very interesting in your paper.
Yeah, the duty to do it, the deontological, it's our duty to do this, and consequentialist, because the ends and the outcomes are so beneficial. So, the thing is, we're sort of resting on the assumption that the species is under threat. And, this is what Elon Musk sort of painted as. We need to safeguard the species. Mm-hmm. And that's fine. But if we're doing that, then why it's possible to point to other activities on the planet that would seem to suggest that pose a far more immediate risk to humanity than some nebulous risk sometime in the future.
Right. So, it's interesting that the word duty is brought up in reference to this. It's to sort of bring us toward saving the species, but I think the last guest we had on, Kathleen Connell, mentioned that using space as a justification for saving humanity is so, well, I wouldn't say short-sighted, but a strange way of looking at it, given that really it's not a viable method of saving the species at all, and it doesn't do one of the main things, which is save the planet, which I think is what a lot of people would agree is a very important part of saving humanity as a whole, is saving the place where we were born and where the species currently exists. I think even some of the late-term space settlement colonies that we talk about have something like a maximum holding of 30,000 people. And if you wanted to save the entire species, you're going to need to build a great deal of Island 3s.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, like I say, I think this concept of saving the species, it's too remote.
Which isn't to say we can't do a great deal for saving the planet by utilizing space colonization and space settlement and space exploitation. There's plenty of things that we can do up there that will benefit humanity down here. But
absolutely. And I think that's the key, and I think that's where I think the answer lies, actually. That by sort of embedding planetary protection as a well, as I say in my article, as a legal as well as an ethical imperative, then what you will do is you'll shape the normative behaviour. You'll shape the behaviour so that the first instinct is, right, if we're going to go, let's make sure we don't make a mess there. Mm-hmm. Simple, And also, by doing that, we'll be able to go back. and we'll be able to reuse it. And so I think you've got a number of these different issues at play. You've got the sort of the driving, slake our mineral thirst, as it were, and get ever more precious metals. Then, well, okay, that's fine. Or it's a sort of a political theatre. Well, why not try and make it an environmental theatre? Why not try and make it environmental activities? We're going to space, and actually we're trying to save the planet. Mm-hmm. But we're saving the planet, and we're saving the other planets, we're saving the environment that we're going to, so that we can keep reusing it, and so that we're not actually trapped in a cycle of waste and of contamination.
It brings, I mean, a lot, this show, strictly speaking, is about space settlement. So in a lot of ways, we're a very futurist-focused show.
Sure.
And one of the things that makes me wonder is I wonder how the efforts that we have done now and, since the early when we first started exploring space and when we first started putting people in space, I wonder how future generations will look back upon us, and I wonder with what sort of attitudes they will see our works in space. Well, I mean, currently on Earth, we're headed toward a future where the idea of sustainability and the threat of climate change and global warming is, I mean, in very recent years, really, it started to become a very respected threat to humanity, and it started to become a very strong field where we're investing a lot of money and a lot of time in trying to find ways to mitigate the damage that we've done. And in a lot of ways, we look back on the past and we sort of shake our heads and go, I can't believe that we were doing that back then. And we look at other elements of the planet and shake our heads and and I wonder if in the future, people will look back on our wanton exploitation of, our orbital space, which is currently packed full of satellites to almost a dangerous level. I wonder if we'll look back and shake our heads and say, wow, I can't believe we were doing that so unfettered and unwise to things.
I think that's exactly right. But I think as well, hindsight is a miraculous gift.
Of course.
I think you at the start of the space race, we never thought that we'd have the amount of satellite technology that we do now. We'd never have thought that, Malaysia and, other countries, Nigeria and South Africa, and would all try and would have, spacefaring or at least a desire to have some space capacity. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's always tempting to look back on that.
I mean, right now, your average citizen has a certain level of spacefaring capacity with CubeSats and rental rockets and so forth. It's expensive, but these days it's totally possible for your average, university or even, I mean, not quite yet, but I'm working on a handful of projects that would mean that students at high schools and such can build a CubeSat to launch into atmosphere. I certainly don't think that the Apollo ethos factored in the idea that, an average high schooler could launch a satellite.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And I think the regulation didn't. And actually, I think the thing that we've got is, wouldn't it be nice if they looked back on us and you could see you say, well, this was the generation that actually decided to embed this notion of sustainability in work, so it didn't get clogged up. Mm-hmm. They learnt the lessons of the early years of space exploration, and they decided to move on and develop and to make sure that they didn't repeat the mistakes. And I think there's some cause for optimism. I don't think that it's a lost cause. I think there's lots and lots of work to do. And I think I think looking to the future and looking as far away as space settlements, I think we have the germ of the space law that's going to govern those settlements. Mm-hmm. I think we have the regulation there that might be useful. Again, this concept of let's try and keep it peaceful. Let's try and get rid of the boundaries that we have on Earth. Let's try and make sure that, we aren't just, polluting irrespective of the consequences of the environment. And I think, I think there are some definite normative, values that we can sort of discern at the minute. Mm-hmm. But I think we need to look a bit further forward and say, okay, is there a way, or rather, how do we make sure that we satisfy the needs now, but also ensure that we don't use up the needs that are going to be in the future.
Right.
And that's the difficult balancing act. That's the real difficult balancing act that legislators and regulators and drafters of legislation have.
You touched upon one element that I think bears repeating, or at least emphasizing, in that a lot of throughout this conversation, you've mentioned the use of regulation as actually a very positive thing for businesses and groups, and something that can push space development and space settlement even in a positive way that will allow more growth rather than less. And I think one thing that we talk about on this show a great deal, and something that I've been frustrated with in the past, is the sort of libertarian attitudes towards space and space development that is taken by a lot of space advocacy proponents and some smaller space companies as well, in that they believe that regulation in and of itself is a dangerous thing that can stifle the growth. But one thing that you've said, as I said, is that actually there's not really a need to fear regulation or an approach to sustainability. Tony Milligan was the last person we had on who talked about planetary protection and sustainability, and he mentioned a few times that he's had a great deal of pushback on his work because people believe that I think he had one paper where he said that he would like the part of the moon or all of the moon to be preserved as some sort of, national park style land that a national heritage site, I think he said. And I thought that was a very interesting subject when posed in the way that he did, made not only a great deal of sense, but asked a lot of really interesting questions. And he had a lot of pushback because some people felt that would somehow eliminate this resource that they were looking at. But as you say, realistically, some regulation actually does help us develop in the right directions and actually allows us to build and push forward these ideas of space settlement and space development in ways that not only are better for us than just wildly going and mining and drilling and grabbing whatever it is that we feel like we need, but also allows us to ethically and morally be okay with the developments that we make.
I think that's right. I mean, I think the thing is, I've recently completed an article on with another space lawyer, a guy called Michael Lissner, talking about the regulation of CubeSats. So looking at how the UK is choosing to regulate CubeSats, and again I won't say heavily criticised, but got criticised for saying, well, look, there you are, you Brits are at it again, regulating. And what you're finding is you're going to strangle the life out of, you're going to strangle the life out of the industry, and that's why Britain's never had a space industry, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. And I think there is this sort of, it's a cultural thing as much as anything, that tends to be, maybe I'm a prisoner of my sort of jurisdiction and a prisoner of my culture, in the fact that I think sensible, intelligent regulation can empower and should empower. And, I do agree with those who argue that there should be no more regulation than is absolutely necessary. Mm. But I think there should be no less regulation than is absolutely necessary.
Exactly.
And I think that's the crucial thing. And I think Tony's done some great work, and I've been privileged to speak with Tony on a number of occasions, and I'm writing a chapter for a book that they're doing at the minute. And I think it's, I'm not sure whether the sort of the heritage site idea is going to work as such. I mean, I think there's certainly an argument for making the Apollo landing sites heritage sites. I think you've got a very strong argument for that. Mm-hmm. But again, I think there's a little bit of problems with that, because, the World Heritage Site, it's sort of the clue's in the title. Mm-hmm. So I think there's issues there. What I'm saying is, well, instead of that, why don't we just have a moratorium on speculative commercial mining? That's what I advocate. A moratorium on lunar speculative commercial mining. Mm-hmm. That'll do two things. Firstly, it will just allow a pause for breath. And secondly, it will say to the companies, right, go somewhere else. Go mm-hmm. somewhere else and regulate somewhere else. And try and do something else, because the moon isn't up for grabs for that type of thing. Sure, we can go there and we can live off the land. We can have, we can have moon bases where we do scientific research. We can have it as a transport hub. That's absolutely fantastic. But let's not go full pelt into it and trash the moon, the very fragile lunar environment, because actually there might not be the stuff you want there anyway. Why don't you go and chase the stuff that is there?
Right. Of which there's plenty of opportunities throughout the solar system.
Oh, for sure.
Finding stuff. I mean, as we said earlier, no one's going to argue that mining an asteroid is a bad idea. And anything you're going to find on the moon, you're more than likely to find in higher quantities on any given asteroid.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing that I'm trying to do. I'm not as radical as some people, and I'm not certainly wouldn't class myself as an asteroid hugger, a term that I've heard used and I absolutely love and I embrace it. But I certainly wouldn't describe myself as that, because I think, we're going to explore, and unfortunately exploration can be messy. Establishing colonies is going to be messy. Humans make waste. That's what we do. And I think sort of one of the things that one of the things that we've got in terms of colonization, I've got a number of students discussing colonization as dissertation projects, and one of the issues that they really can't get to, that they really sort of find astonishing, is the issue of death. What happens when a human colonist dies? I mean, it's one of the things that Mars One has sort of not really adequately dealt with. One of the many things that Mars One has not particularly dealt with very well. But it's what happens when when a human being dies? Do you bury it? Well, you're contaminating the planet with a dead human. Okay.
Well, I mean, not even that. If you're talking about the sort of settlement that we usually focus on the show, you're talking about free space settlements, and where exactly do you plan on burying something on an O'Neill cylinder?
Yeah, I mean, do you just pump them out into space? Do you, or you surely don't burn them? That seems a horrific waste of resources, So it's a problem, and it's a thing that it's something. Whether it's the taboo of death, whether we tend to like to focus on the tech problems, But there is this key issue of what happened. What do we do with dead humans when we do go out and stay out?
That's really incredible. It's not even something I've ever considered myself.
Because you can the problem with it is you can dismiss one or two dead humans. Yes, okay, we'll pump them into space. But what if that becomes the normal way of disposing, and you have a large scale colony, an emerging and expanding colony? You're gonna have people dying on it because
that's a giant floating cloud of corpses outside after 100 years of a settlement. Really is not the image that most space fiction,
So that's the one thing that I think we that humanity needs to sort of get to grips with, these taboos of death, the taboo of the taboo of sex and sexuality, and also what are we looking to do on these colonies? We need to be aware that by colonizing a place, either a freestanding one or a planetary colony, we're going to be different as a species. We're going to inevitably change as a species, because that's what evolution do. That's why humans are so adaptable, because they evolve, and they evolve to their environment. And are we sort of prepared that that's going to be a consequence of this? It might be an intended and desired consequence. Well, that's fine. But again, we just need to start the conversation.
Exactly. And on that, I think that's pretty much where we're going to wrap. Chris, is there anything you'd like to, before we go, is there any websites or work that you've done that you'd like to plug before we shut off?
Well, if you're giving me a plug, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to thank my university for actually letting me research this area. I think it shows a particularly brave mindset, and exactly what education and academia needs is to try and do this forward thinking, this ambitious area of law that I suspect if I'd have gone to other places, they may have been a little less happy that I've been doing it. But I've received nothing but support from the institution. So University of Sunderland, I'll give them a real big shout out. And it's a great place to come and study space law. If we do it as interestingly, we do it as part of the mainstream LLB. We don't do it as a standalone course. We do it as part of our law degree. So it's an option. So you've got, you might have options of commercial law, or contract law, tort law, and then you can do space law as well. So it's actually, I'm trying to get it embedded within the mainstream rather than have it as sort of a standalone thing. it's actually part of the academic legal training. So, again, I think that's one of the things that I'm very pleased about. So thank you very much for allowing me to mention my university. I'm very proud to be there, and I'm very proud that they support this work. And yeah, if you go to the university website, you'll see my website. I'm also on academia.edu. I put some of my papers up on there as well, the ones that, sort of copyright allows. And so if you're interested in my work, I am on academia.edu. I'm also on Twitter, at Chris Newman 1972. And I put a lot of space law stuff out there and a lot of legal stuff that's related to space and tech as well.
Great. We'll leave some links to that in the description below. Make sure to check it out, everyone. Thanks very much, Chris.
Thank you very much indeed, Liam. It's been a real pleasure.
Hey, you've been great. Hey folks, thanks for listening to Voices from L5. A couple things before we go. I want to say a big thank you to John Boswell, who makes Symphony of Science. That's the music that's playing right now and the music that plays right at the beginning. Check him out at YouTube under Melody Sheep. Secondly, I want to say a huge thank you to all of our Patreons, but especially Nick LaCrome, our current $10 Patreon. Without you guys, the show wouldn't really be going anywhere. And biggest news of all, of course, is that this microphone that you're currently hearing me from is courtesy of our Patreon donators. So thank you very much again. If you guys are interested in becoming Patreon donators, check out my Patreon. That's patreon.com/voicesfroml5. We got some really fantastic goals and some really great stuff we want to do with the show in the future that we need a little bit of support to get there. Check it out. As little as $1 a month really does make a difference. If you guys want to support the show in a different way, feel free to like, share, subscribe, link this show around a little bit, tell your friends, and vote 5 wherever you might be listening to us. It really helps to get the word out that way. Lastly, I do want to say if you guys have any interest or feedback or anything you just want to talk to me about, feel free to email me at voicesfroml5@gmail.com. I check it all the time, and I'm always on the lookout for new guests or show ideas. Thanks, guys.